In 1937 Los Angeles, billionaire Hannon writes a letter for a hotel employee. In the letter, he reveals he's made a dangerous discovery that might get him killed. He then heads to the ballroom and hands the letter to bartender Ashton, telling him someone named Douglas will pick it up later.
To keep this letter, somebody will ask for the man named Douglas Hall. Douglas Hall.
After Hannon leaves, Ashton gets curious and opens the letter. Whatever's inside shakes him. Meanwhile, Hannon returns home, gets into bed with his wife. Then suddenly, everything around him vanishes. He wakes up in a lab in 1999. Turns out, the entire 1937 world is just a virtual reality simulation created by Hannon's company. He leaves the lab, heads to a bar, takes his meds, and makes a call to Douglas. But his message is cut short when he sees someone unexpected at the back door. Shocked, he follows them into a dark alley. Just as he's about to reveal his discovery, the stranger pulls out a knife and kills him.
What are you doing?
The next morning, Douglas listens to his messages, but is interrupted when he finds blood on his sink and a blood-stained shirt in the trash. Before he can process it, he hears a message from the police telling him to come to the station immediately. There, Detective McBain shows him a dead body. It's Hannon. Shocked and devastated, Douglas confirms the identity and tells the detective he wasn't just Hannon's employee, but also his close friend. McBain and Douglas visit Hannon's office. The detective asks about the company's projects, but Douglas only says they develop computer software. Everything else is confidential.
So what exactly do you people do here?
Computer research.
Then, they notice a woman named Jane in another room. Douglas is surprised when she says she's Hannon's daughter because his boss never mentioned having kids. He also feels like he's seen her before. While McBain questions Jane, Douglas heads to the 13th floor to see a programmer named Whitney, who is mourning Hannon's death. Whitney talks about the simulation they've been working on, an artificial version of Los Angeles that Hannon kept visiting even though it wasn't ready for testing. When Douglas asks if Whitney knew about Jane, he says no. Back in the lobby, Douglas sees Jane leaving in a cab. Suspicious, he asks the receptionist where she's staying and decides to follow her. Meanwhile, McBain questions Whitney about the company's research. Whitney explains that their virtual reality is filled with self-learning characters who don't know they're just computer programs. The reason they chose 1937 Los Angeles? Hannon wanted to relive his youth. At the hotel, Douglas confronts Jane and asks about her last conversation with Hannon. She says she was living in France when her father called her to the U.S. to help shut down the company. Later, Jane meets with Hannon's lawyer to discuss the will, only to find out Hannon made a last-minute change, leaving the company to Douglas. McBain delivers the same news to Douglas, leaving both him and Jane shocked. Now, Douglas becomes a suspect. He insists he never spoke to Hannon on the day of the murder, but McBain reveals that Hannon's calling card was used right before his death.
Because we checked Fuller's phone records. He made a call with his calling card at 11:02 p.m. Your home number?
At home, Douglas listens to his voicemail and finally hears Hannon's last message. Hannon says he discovered something incredible and hid a letter inside the simulation. The recording cuts off as Hannon asks someone, "How did you find me?" Douglas rushes to the office and searches for Hannon's details on the computer. He asks Whitney to connect him, but Whitney hesitates, warning him it's dangerous. Douglas insists, saying the clues either prove he killed Hannon and forgot, or that he's being framed. Whitney gives him an hour, but Douglas pushes for 2, which is risky. Douglas enters the simulation chamber, and after flashing lights and a time transfer, he finds himself in a virtual reality world, inside the body of a bank clerk. The experience feels strange, and he runs to the bathroom to collect himself. His boss notices he looks awful and gives him the day off. Stepping outside, Douglas is amazed by how real the old Los Angeles looks. He remembers that Hannon's avatar was an antique shop owner in Pasadena, so he takes a cab there. When he arrives, he is stunned. The shop owner, Grierson, looks exactly like Hannon. Grierson doesn't recognize Douglas, but finds him familiar. Douglas then heads to a hotel and asks the dancers about Hannon. One of them tells him to find Ashton. To his shock, Ashton looks just like Whitney, but Douglas keeps his thoughts to himself and starts asking questions. Ashton reveals that Hannon is a regular customer and prefers young girls, which disturbs Douglas. When he asks about a letter, Ashton acts clueless. Suddenly, Douglas starts feeling sick. His time in the simulation is running out. He rushes to the bathroom as his body convulses. In an instant, he wakes up in the lab, still unwell. Meanwhile, inside the simulation, the bank clerk is confused and doesn't know how he got there. Whitney helps Douglas recover and scolds him for choosing 2 hours, but his frustration fades when Douglas describes how real the experience felt. However, Whitney gets angry again when he learns that Hannon was using the simulation for inappropriate activities. Their conversation is cut short when a guard informs them that someone is waiting for Douglas in the lobby. Douglas meets Tom, who says he saw Hannon at the bar the other night. Tom asks to talk in private, so Douglas takes him to the parking lot. Suddenly, Tom demands money and attacks Douglas, accusing him of taking Hannon. Douglas fights back, smashing Tom's head into a car window. Tom calls him crazy and says he's like someone on America's Most Wanted before running away.
We'll see you on America's Most Wanted.
Later, Douglas calls Jane and invites her to dinner. He tells her about the message Hannon left him, but can't remember if he saw or spoke to Hannon the day he died. Jane tells Douglas to go to the police and warns that the simulation might be messing with his memory. Douglas feels like he's met Jane before, but she avoids talking about her past. Instead, she asks him to dance and admits she also feels like she knows him. She explains that déjà vu might mean love at first sight, and they kiss. That night, police show up at Douglas' apartment and arrest him for Hannon's murder. At the station, Detective McBain shows security footage of Douglas' car outside the bar where Hannon was killed. The detective believes Douglas murdered Hannon to stop him from shutting down the company. Tom also told the police he saw Douglas leaving the bar with Hannon, but now Tom has turned up dead. Douglas spends the night in jail until Jane bails him out with an alibi. Determined to find the truth, Douglas goes to the lab and logs into the simulation, setting the timer for 2 hours. But he forgets to press a button, so the timer doesn't start. The computer tries to warn him, but he's already inside the chamber. Inside the simulation, Douglas finds himself in the middle of a dance competition. He quickly ditches his partner and heads to an antique shop. He throws a rock at the window to get Grierson's attention. At first, Grierson refuses to talk, but Douglas insists he can explain why he sometimes blacks out and wakes up confused. Grierson admits he has strange flashes of another man's life, and that his wife has even smelled perfume on his clothes. Douglas finds something strange under his bed, a briefcase with a fancy suit. He doesn't remember buying or wearing it, but it fits him perfectly. He realizes Hannon must have left it there to use whenever he logged in. Later, Douglas takes Grierson to a hotel where the staff calls him Hannon. In the ballroom, Grierson focuses hard to recover Hannon's memories. Seeing the girls helps. He remembers Hannon giving a letter to a man. When Grierson points at the bartender, Ashton quickly sneaks out. Douglas follows Ashton to the locker room, but Ashton ambushes him with a gun. He admits he read the letter and realized he's not real, just an artificial creation. Following Hannon's instructions, he drove to Tucson, breaking past barricades until he reached the edge of the world. That's when he understood this reality is fake. Furious, he demands Douglas show him the truth. Laughing like a madman, Ashton shoots Douglas in the shoulder and leg. Just as he's about to finish him off, Douglas fights back and escapes. Ashton chases him, firing wildly. Douglas, bleeding, hides in the swimming pool. When Ashton follows the blood trail, Douglas catches him off guard and attacks. He wrestles the gun from Ashton and forces him to hand over the letter. But it's a trick. Ashton grabs Douglas and slams him into a column. Both men fall into the water, where Ashton overpowers Douglas and tries to drown him. Just as Douglas is about to lose consciousness, Whitney pulls him out of the simulation. In shock, Douglas punches Whitney before realizing he's back home. Later, Douglas tells Whitney that the people in the simulation are as real as they are, with their own thoughts and feelings. He believes they shouldn't be messing with their minds, that the whole project was a mistake. Whitney insists it's just programming, but Douglas storms off. At the hotel, Douglas meets McBain, who tells him that Jane has vanished. After digging into it, McBain confirms that Hannon never had kids and that no woman named Jane exists in the US or France. Worried, Douglas tracks down the taxi driver who picked Jane up days ago and pays him for information. The driver says she went to a nearby neighborhood, so Douglas heads there and eventually finds out that Jane's body belongs to a grocery store cashier. When Douglas sees her, she doesn't recognize him but admits he looks familiar. Still thinking about Ashton's story, Douglas follows the path described in the letter, passing through barriers until he reaches the world's edge. To his shock, he finds a wall of code and wireframe, proving his 1999 reality is just as fake as the 1937 one. It also means he isn't real either. Meanwhile, McBain tracks down the cashier who looks like Jane, but she doesn't recognize him either. After checking her records, he learns her friends noticed she's been staying out all night and sleeping all day. Just then, Jane takes control of that body, spots McBain outside, and hides. She quickly calls Douglas and tells him to meet her at Hannon's office. Once there, Jane reveals the truth. There are countless virtual worlds, but this is the only one that created a simulation within a simulation. She didn't kill Hannon. She was sent after his death to pose as his daughter and take over the company. Her mission was to shut it down, but Hannon outsmarted them by changing his will. Douglas did stab Hannon, but only because his body was being controlled by a VR user, her husband, David. Jane explains that David got addicted to the simulation and turned into an abusive man. Since Douglas and Hannon both saw the world's edge, she believes they have real souls. She's been watching Douglas since the beginning and has fallen in love with him. But Douglas insists he isn't real and can't be loved until Jane kisses him. One thing leads to another, and they end up in bed. Meanwhile, Whitney connects to the virtual reality and appears inside Ashton's body while he's driving. Whitney tries to dodge traffic, but still crashes into some boxes and cans. As he checks his new body in the mirror, the police show up and ask for his license. While searching the glove box, he finds a gun and quickly hides it before handing over Ashton's wallet. The cop buys his excuse about the car slipping in the rain and lets him go. But just as Whitney is about to leave, a noise comes from the trunk. The officer makes him open it, and inside is a bleeding bank teller tied up.
All right, get your hands in the air and step away from the trunk.
Shit, man, it's Douglas.
Back up! I said back the hell up!
Hey, this isn't Chuck.
The cop moves to arrest Whitney, but in shock, he stumbles backward and gets hit by another car. At that moment, the timer runs out, and Whitney wakes up back in the lab. Confused, he struggles with the automatic doors, randomly poking at things. A guard notices his odd behavior on the security cameras and alerts Douglas. As Douglas heads to the lab, Jane calls McBain. When Douglas arrives at the company, he finds a guard knocked out and his gun missing. Inside, he sees Whitney laughing at the TV like it's something new. A quick conversation confirms it. Whitney is gone, and Ashton is taken over because Whitney died in the crash. Douglas explains that this world is also fake, but Ashton insists on seeing where he was born. As they take the elevator, Jane's husband, David, takes over Douglas' body. He stays silent, leading Ashton to the room filled with computers that run the simulation. While Ashton looks around, David finds a guard's gun and shoots him twice. David then reunites with Jane, pretending to be Douglas. As they kiss, he suddenly reveals his true identity and starts attacking her, furious that she betrayed him. He throws her onto the bed and chokes her, but she grabs an alarm clock and smashes it against his head. She runs for the elevator as David fires at her. When he tries to grab the doors, she pounds on his hand until he lets go. Furious, he keeps shooting, but the bullets don't get through. Jane reaches the lobby, only to find the front doors locked. David catches up, ready to shoot, but McBain, who came after Jane's call, shoots David first. It turns out Jane planned everything, trapping David's consciousness in this world for good. Moments later, Douglas wakes up in David's real body and realizes it's now 2024. Jane wakes up too and introduces him to her futuristic world. She also greets her father on the beach, revealing that his face was the model for Hannon. Thank you for watching. See you in next one.